What I want to talk to you today is about something that I feel we have in our field an uneasy relationship with, and that is memory. I say that because I think that it's our history, our past, that has kind of really put quite a shadow over our field, and that's behaviorism. Now, I have to kind of step back a little bit and say I am not going to say we should all turn behaviorist again. But what I am going to say is that maybe we really need to think about memory a little bit differently. Particularly, I'm going to focus on one type of memory today. Because indeed, as Bilbao said, there's no learning without memory, and in particular, language learning really requires it. So if language teachers, as language teachers, we negate it, then what's happening? So that's what I want to talk about. I've put here, hopefully, what I want to cover, really memory, what we're talking about, why we're talking about it, the idea of whether it's been negated, which is kind of the premise I'm going to use today, and then keep it practical. So really think about some practical ideas, because if anybody's been taught by me, you know that's the only way I can do it, right? So, so let's think indeed about memory and what it is. Now, I think for a confluence of reasons, as I mentioned, we've kind of got a bit lost in terms of what we think about it. Most of the time when you mention memory to people, they immediately think of rote learning, they think of drilling, they think of repetition, they think of practice activities, not much creativity. And that's how I started teaching. I was on the cusp. I had a behaviorist course book, but then I had to soon switch to be creative and communicative. But now, because of the leaching of neuroscience into our field, if you go to any conference, you'll see talks and talks and talks about neuroscience. We now have an idea of how our brain is working, which we didn't when I started teaching. So a lot of what we said about teaching was really from our own anecdotal experience. And we probably weren't far wrong. But now we can get a little bit more efficient and a little bit more precise about what it is. Because actually people can take MRIs and they can see the synapse. They can see how prior knowledge actually interacts with new knowledge. We've got MRIs that show us. So we can't negate that, because that's actually going to help us in the long run. It's going to give us a lot to our field. And I think that the more you can go to conferences and think about, okay, who's saying what and why, that's helpful. This is what I think basically are the concerns. And I've mentioned a few things that I've heard. I'm actually going to change Scott Thornbury, but I remember him actually saying this to me. I was unconvinced that elicit and repeat would result in conversational fluency. I think the answer to that is actually yes and no, right? Yes, it possibly doesn't if you stop at that. But if you don't start with that, you don't get conversational fluency. You need to have a foundation, and he has kind of backtracked a little bit. Fear of behaviorism. I definitely was really scared of being the boring teacher, and the boring teacher was equated as the one who did repeat, repeat, repeat. In French, I remember écouter, répéter. That was how I learned French, and you can see it didn't get me very far. And then Chomsky, who really didn't help us at all, by saying, well, why repeat other people's language? And actually, I'm going to be really facetious, because of course it's Chomsky, and say, but you need to in the beginning. We've got to. I think of myself as a beginner language learner. I had to repeat what other people said because I didn't have the language. Our focus very much has been on creative language use. That's great. But why do I put this here? Does anybody know that? Is this just a British thing to say? No. What is going to happen to that baby? It's thrown out. And really, do we want that? No. We want to keep the baby, but we do want the dirty bathwater. So as with our field completely, we've done the pendulum swing, right? We've gone, okay, definitely not. So let's go all the way over there. And we've lost something. We've lost something we need. This I hear repeatedly, right? I also run the practicum at the MA TESOL. So I get the privilege of observing many, many teachers teaching, and in actual fact, I've observed many of the people teaching in this room. Why do you think I hear this so much? I don't like to do repetition in class. Speak to me. You can shout at me, just make sure it's in line with the question that I'm asking. Why is it uncomfortable?
Well, because you feel that students are, kind of staring at you and just kind of taking on the same, rote repetition, and it's boring.
Everybody agree with her? It's boring. How do you feel the students feel? Say it a bit louder, sorry.
They might feel, the teachers might feel that the students might feel taken aback that repeating the same thing over.
That it's getting, I'm saying it. So it's an interesting thing, and we've done that to ourselves. We now feel guilty about doing something that I think is absolutely critical. When I think of my own language learning, without repetition, I wouldn't have got anywhere. Right? So we've actually done something quite negative to our own mindset. But as I've mentioned, there is now a tidal shift. Things are changing. People are changing what they think about language learning, mostly because behaviorism is quite far away from us now. We've had the ability to think of neuroscience, and we've equally had the ability to think about students as cognitive learners. Right? They aren't just there to rote memorize. They have a brain. They can think. They can process. And we'll look at the stages of acquisition in a minute. So we're able to embrace a slightly different thing. And there's lots of people who say some brave things here. So first of all, Nick Bilbao, who I've read a lot in the last couple of months, he's done some wonderful memory activities, which we're actually going to experience one today. Memory underpins every aspect of successful language learning. Every aspect. Having a good memory is a key component of language learning aptitude. That was said in 1998. So, as Mary said, and showing the chronology of my work life, when I was here, things were changing. Speakers do as much remembering as they do putting language together. If you think about it, you can't put language together if you can't remember it. Right? You can't have a conversation if you haven't got the language there embedded somewhere. Memory and practice are good. This is actually Peter Doolittle. He did a TED talk. That really is his name. So when I say Dr. Doolittle, please don't laugh. Because it took me, and I thought, my husband said, they will never believe you. I didn't make his name up. He did that as a response to questions that practice was negative. Right? Repetition is practice. Drilling is practice. So it's maybe not as negative as we think. And then Zoltan Dornier, who many of you like, Roshi Jolly in the front there, adores him. But actually, I wanted to say this to you. He goes as far as to say, wow, look, we do need some rote learning. Right? We do need some rote learning. So in my summary, I mentioned that memory is actually a language learning aptitude. That's how elevated the role it has, as seen by other people, but maybe not seen by teachers. So J.B. Carroll in 1965, a long time ago, came up with the idea of, okay, well, what is language learning aptitude? What makes people good at language learning? And he came up with phonemic encoding, inductive language learning ability, grammatical sensitivity, associative memory capacity. I'm going to change that in a minute because we've slightly changed the language. But phonemic encoding, right? What is that? Tell me. Pronunciation, being able to hear something and then encode it, understand it. Inductive language learning, give people patterns and they will be able to kind of work it. And if you see that makes perfect sense, you've got to be able to understand something phonologically. You've then got to be able to do some analysis of the language independently. So that makes sense. Grammatical sensitivity. So this would follow very much kind of with the idea of Schmidt's noticing hypothesis, that you can actually look at something and go, oh, right, let me break it down. Or if I look at a word, let me think of the formation. Let me look at the stem. And then the associative memory bit got chopped off for a long time. But that's been brought in, that in actual fact, having a good memory is incredibly useful. And I'm going to talk about what type of memory in a minute. So that all determines how good a language learner will be. And in actual fact, that really hasn't changed. We haven't changed what constitutes good language learning. Instead, what we've done is explored it a little bit more. And if you look at the MLAT test, does anybody know that for language learning aptitude? Basically, one of the things that the students have to do is in 4 minutes memorize words. In this instance, it was Kurdish words. So that shows you how important people think it is. It's not only being able to just feel confident, because often that's what we say. You know, we think, oh, a good language learner is somebody who's confident. A good language learner is somebody who's prepared to stab and have a go. Absolutely, that's all true, but so is this. And then, in other words, it's recognized as an essential feature of language learning. Now, to see this, how many of you answered my questionnaires? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm going to pretend and think it was the whole lot of you. So I sent out some questionnaires really because I wanted to see, do people agree with me? Do people have the same opinion as I do? And this is what I took from it, because this is actually the beginning of research I'm doing. But what I asked teachers, first of all, there was 50 teachers and 30 students. Do you ask your students to memorize anything? I just wanted to know if for homework you said, right, go home and memorize these, because we still feel it's a dirty word. Then I asked the students, what do you think is most difficult? And I asked the teachers too. So I've picked this out for you to see. And if we have a look at the first one, 46% of teachers said they didn't ask the students to memorize anything. Nothing. So there's about half of the people, so half of the 50, and I am hoping to grow this, didn't bother saying anything to their students about, well, you need to actually memorize it, right? And then, additionally to that, when we look at it, 42% said they did sometimes. So the majority of people aren't really, the majority of teachers, I should say, aren't talking about memory. So I want you to look inward right now. And I want you to think of the last term, and I'm not going to ask you to do pair work. It's when you said to your students, you need to memorize that, okay? Your fluency is lagging because you need to memorize something, okay? Then when I asked what is the most difficult thing to learn or to memorize, did everybody agree with this? Do you all think this would be the case? Yeah? Everybody said vocabulary. So remember when, I don't know, I mean, I'm 50, I'll be absolutely honest. Mary kind of like stretched out my years. I was told every week to learn 10 German words, 10 French words. That's what I had to do. That was a given. In fact, I didn't even get told to do it. I knew that we would have a pop-up test every Friday. Now, interestingly enough, research has proven that students who do tests, pop-up tests, not formal tests, pop-up tests, do far better as language learners than students who don't. So again, we are frightened of testing our students. We don't have to make it the big I all sit down and write. But we do have to think about what could we do to maybe help them a little bit and embrace it. Students also said it was the hardest thing to memorize vocabulary. So now I need to really think about what memory is that I want to talk about, because most of us, and I'm not being rude when I say this because it happened to me when I started to do this work, was we think about long-term memory. And sometimes we think about short-term memory, even though I'm going to say right now it looks, and I am not a researcher in this field at all, but the neuroscientists don't look like they want to talk about short-term memory anymore. What they want to start to talk about is something called working memory. Is this familiar to some people, right? So I'd rather talk about that, and we'll talk about it in a minute and how it works. So if we think about long-term memory, what long-term memory is almost like a filing cabinet, right? You have memories, and they can be lots of different types of memories. There's lots, in fact, I didn't realize this, but you can have declarative memories, you can have learned memories, you can have smell memories, all sorts of things. They are long-term, we file them away, and we'll pull them out when we want to use them, when it's relevant, okay? So supposedly, even though when I told my husband this, I actually questioned it in his case, but supposedly there's unlimited capacity. I can swear it's limited. So, like, for him, I'm not going to say male, I'm not going to say women, I'm saying, and also unlimited lifespan, which is really interesting to me. And it wasn't just one or two researchers who said that, it was many. Now, of course, I am not negating illness, Alzheimer's, dementia. Of course, that's a whole other thing. But if we look at just the brain, forget the person, forget the age, it's unlimited and it can be a lifespan. What's problematic for us is that we find it difficult to retrieve. Okay? Working memory, though, is the new kid on the block as far as I'm concerned. It certainly was for me, and it's really cool. So we're going to do an experiment first of all, and then we're going to work out what working memory is, because in actual fact, I had to do this to be able to understand. So what I want you to do is I'm going to say 5 words, and I want you to try and remember them. Okay? You all with me? Table, cat, wholesome, memory, acquisition. Now I want you to times 8 by 8. So 8 times 8. 8 multiplied by 8. Now I want you to think of the last 4 letters of the alphabet, and in your head, say them backwards. Last, I know you're all smiling at me. I couldn't do it either, so I love the fact that you can't either. Now I want you to turn to your partner and say those 5 words. Okay, just say them. Okay, so shout out, what happens when you do that? Any thoughts?
I saw a cat on a table.
Excellent. Wow. Francis is just going to get an absolute bottle of water. Great job. Great job. Okay, yeah. You visualized it, right? That's what we in the field say, visualize.
I did not visualize.
What?
I was tapping my foot and repeating the words in my head.
Right. So can we have that? Can we just keep that in our memory, because you two, I didn't prime them. Anything?
When you said to times 8 by 8, I just continued to repeat the words in my head. I just skipped that part.
Well, if you're going to cheat, then...
It was prioritized.
Yeah, nice. Very useful. Very useful. So you redeemed yourself there, you know. Yeah. Exactly. Right? Thank you. So that's good. Anything else? Anybody else? Rini? Stressed. Excellent. Yeah, good.
We're trying to, at first you were, I don't know if you did that on purpose, but the first few words were easy to visualize.
Yes.
So, how am I going to do that?
Yeah, exactly. Then you get to one, it's like wholesome. Is that a person or bread? Right, okay. Yeah. Milk is wholesome? Oh, and the cat is wholesome? Oh, okay, yeah. You probably could have a wholesome cat. It's just, what would an unwholesome cat do is my question. Sorry, way at the back.
Before I did the math problem, I repeated the words. I went through all 5 twice before I did anything else.
Right, interesting.
I just made an acronym with the first letters.
Ah, little old strategy woman over there. Karen.
I had a feeling you were going to ask us what those 5 words were, so I was able to
You prioritize, yeah.
think simultaneously.
Yeah, and not many of us can. So that is, I mean, what you've just said, and we'll look at it, is working memory. And it is, if you think about it, it's all we see in our lessons when we're teaching. So everything you went through, from being stressed, which was a very important thing, to the additional, I want you to do this, now I want you to do that, now I want you to do this. Think of your lessons. Think of how many things we ask our students to do and what is happening to them as we're asking them to do it. This is really important to think of in terms of pace, right? The pace of your lessons. Often I give feedback and say, well, that lesson, is paid. Did you feel it was going a bit quick? The 20 words versus the 5. It's actually much more important than I thought, right? It's much more critical. So I'll show a demonstration in a minute, but so often it's described as just this idea of a workspace. So that's why sometimes it's confusing a little bit, I think, when we think of working memory. Because yes, it is memory, but it's very short-term memory, which is why the idea of short-term has kind of been negated. It's concerned with, as this says, the immediate conscious, perceptual, and linguistic processing. Right? And if you think about it, that's what some of you are doing. Some of you are visualizing it. Some of you are getting a rhythm. Some of you were processing it at maybe a language level. But it's this idea of immediate that I think is really useful. So when you think of giving instructions to our students now, right, it kind of makes us think slightly differently, doesn't it? Can be described as holding short-term information in your mind while using the information to accomplish a task. Right, that's definitely what you did today. And then the gateway to long-term memory. That, I think, is critical because it means, as it was over here, which if we went further along the line, what you did was you decided what's relevant, what's irrelevant. Right, the gateway. So maybe if I'd have said instead of saying, I mean, who's going to remember cat? Gone. Who's going to remember table? Not so important. But acquisition of memory, that's what I'm talking about. That's what she's talking about. So I'm going to keep that a little bit longer because I need that. I need that for this whole hour or whatever it is. Okay? So it's slightly different the way we receive things. But gateway is a very useful thing to think about. Opposite to long-term memory, it's limited. And in actual fact, in 1955, and I sound like I know tons about this, it's just because I've been reading for a while, they decided 7. We couldn't, in our working memory, we could keep 7 things, right? Now, that's been changed, and it's been changed again. So first of all, it was changed to not necessarily 1 word or 7 words, but 7 chunks. So related things. So maybe if we did clothes, you might remember more than 1 or 2 clothes because it's a chunk. It's seen as a sort of a, I don't want to say a group, as a chunk. Now we've got worse. This is the good news. Our memory is now much worse. It's 4. So it's extremely limited, right? And now I want to add on or layer on the fact that we're teaching language learners. So this is just talking about regular learning. This isn't talking about doing it in a different language. So add that to the mix. It's also the final part, the part of the brain that is responsible for working memory is also responsible for concentration and attention. And often these two get linked together with working memory, right? They often, oh, somebody's lost attention, so their working memory is probably overloaded, okay? It's useful to think about, I think. And this is what it looks like. So again, I've used this from somebody called Baddeley. And if anybody wants information about what I've talked about today, my email's at the end, and I will share this PowerPoint, or somebody else will, and we'll talk about, I can answer questions. But this is how working memory looks. So at the top, it's got an executive. So that's the control. Then, what did Frances say she did? Do you remember? Yes, visualize, great. Visualize. So we've got a visuospatial sketchpad. That can be incorporated. That if we suddenly think, okay, this is how I remember things, by having it. So we do, we visualize it. Other people sounded it out, right? That would be part of the... In fact, these two kind of go together, the phonological and the episodic. Episodic will kind of remember everything else, but also put it a little bit more in order. And if you see, these are all working with our long-term memory systems, right? And they're saying systems because the jury is out on saying long-term memory finite. But basically, it's going forwards and backwards, forwards and backwards, forwards and backwards, with a picture of something, a kind of a chronology of something. I've heard it. Of course, this is in what type of speed? Nanoseconds, right? Absolutely. If you think about it, I'm talking to you right now. You're receiving what I'm saying. You're listening to my pronunciation. That might throw you off. Oh, it's a Brit, whatever. That's different. But you're doing it so quickly. And these are called slaves. It's a bit not exactly politically correct, but these are called slaves because it's all controlled by the top one. And then it all works with this one. So now I just want to throw in something about, we all know the idea of activating prior knowledge, right? We've had this ingrained in teacher training. Now tell me why. It's visualized right there. It builds. This would be seen to be our prior knowledge, right? And look how it's working with things in the immediate space of a lesson. So if I say something like cat, you might bing, but I know what a cat is. 8 times 8 is a learned memory, right? It's learned. But it's where? Is it here? Is it here? Is it here? It's there. So prior knowledge is even more important after I've looked at this. So we're always going to think about how we work with that. And why is all of this important? And it's because of this. Now, first of all, I showed this to my husband because I had to try. And he said, why are you going to show them a dead dog? This is not a dead dog. The dog is tired. It's not dead. Yeah. Right, okay? It's very, very, very tired. No animal was hurt during the making of this plenary. So, but this is why we need to take it into account. Because this, as a trainer, is what I experienced. Now, I had horrific experience about, I don't know, a good few decades ago where I tried to learn Cantonese. I was living in Hong Kong. And a colleague that I was working with, he could speak fluently. And he said, don't worry, I'll teach you. And I was like, oh, great, I've always wanted to. And I was staying in Asia for a while. I thought this is very helpful. So me got a few chums together, and we went to the class. And it was horrific. In fact, that's an understatement. I felt as though, well, I can't really explain. It would go into the realms of awful. But in one lesson, he did 50 vocabulary words, 3 different tones, which I couldn't even get a tone. I was like lost at what, you know. I mean, it didn't get me at hello. It was goodbye, see you, never again type of thing. And all the other things. And I definitely, at that point, and it changed the way I trained teachers forever, got to overload, cognitive overload, and cognitive fatigue. And we've now got these names for them. When this happened to me, I didn't have a name. And the worst thing was I had to stop those lessons. And he was a colleague of mine. So I had to do this kind of nasty breakup of like, it's not you, it's me. And we worked together for another 6 months. But in actual fact, when I thought about this, I was like, wait a minute. It's not me, it's him. He pummeled us. So I think that you really have to think of working memory with this. I often use, and anybody who's been taught by me knows this, the example of the tray. Now, you know if you've got a tray or like you're getting people's dirty glasses, you're picking them up. What happens if you put one too many? You lose the lot. That's, interestingly, what happens with working memory. That things don't stick when there's too many things you're trying to stick. It's got to be fed quite simply, right? So Linda Hecker, who has done more research than most on this, we talk about cognitive workspace. When you have new information, it's easy to overload your space. And then things, it doesn't say that there because it's behind the dead dog, fall off. So in other words, one too many things and you've lost everything. Have you ever had, and I have many times, had that experience where you've taught and you've thought, God, that was a great lesson. Gave them about 15 vocabulary words, they're set. Oh, and then I threw in the present simple. You know, I had to go into the past because if you do the simple, you can't do the present without the past. It's all relative. And I was like, oh, they're golden. And then they came the next lesson, and what did they know? Zip. In fact, most of them probably didn't even come back, right? And it's this scenario. So what I'm arguing is that we're working with brains rather than content, right? Now, as well, and I spoke to Caitlin Morgan, who's my colleague here, and she sort of said, oh my gosh, it's so critical that you're doing this, and this is why. If you think about our students now, unlike me when I was learning Cantonese, really, if you think about it, it was no excuse for me not being able to understand stuff. I didn't have the internet then. Yeah, back in the day, we did not have the internet. But now, look at all these things, right? What do people keep telling us? Like the New York Times regularly has articles telling us what's happening. What is happening to us? Yeah, our attention span's getting shorter. Our working memory may be doing the same thing. In part because if we don't like something, what do? Go on to the next. It's a clickable age. And unfortunately, that's leading to a lot of bombardment, a lot of different things. And you know what's even harder is when you're in the class, your students are already on the phone. So they're pummeling themselves, right? So this is one of the reasons we probably need to pay more attention. As well as, this is from Ebbinghaus. I don't know if anybody's seen this. I was shown this when I first started teaching. Right? You've seen this? Look at what happens if you teach something day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6. And this is assuming that you don't go and reteach it or do practice with it. When have we lost? By day 6, we've lost. Exactly. It very quickly diminishes, right? And actually, at the very, very beginning, we lose most. Right? So again, think about being in that classroom. Think about teaching. Think about the 3-hour lesson that you have. Now, this has had a huge impact on us because I'm going to talk in a moment about something called practicing and when we practice in different intervals. But it becomes important because we're just not as bright as we thought we were, right? Or at least I feel completely vindicated. It's very difficult to juggle everything that we're getting all of the time. And I know I'm making working memory sound awful. It's actually a fantastic thing. It's why we can breathe. If we didn't have working memory, we would all be in a coma, which wouldn't be good, right? We need it, but this happens. Also, now we've got a much better idea of the stages of acquisition, or what different words are that we can use to understand what learning is. And by getting those, we now have a better understanding of how memory works within those and how critical it is. So it goes back to the idea of aptitude. So if you first see something, the first thing that you will do is process it, right? Think of the students in your class. They get input. They begin to process it. They begin to notice things. Right? Schmidt mentioned it, but it actually came before then too. But they'll notice things. They'll notice maybe third person S if we're lucky. They'll notice that there's how many words in the sentence. They'll notice sound. Then pattern identification, which is what we all do. We see something. We are pattern-making machines. Our brain likes patterns. We don't like things when it's not in order. Right? If you just think of it in a very practical sense, you know, you walk into a room and there's papers on the desk, and this is me. It might not be you, but I have to. Like, I can't. It can't be like that. It has to be piles, right? But we want a pattern. We want to see it, and we will do that automatically. Extension, meaning you're thinking, okay, how can I now use this? How can I move this out of this specific thing? Complexification and restructuring, that's the use again, right? Can I make it more complicated? Can I start to experiment with it? Does it have to look the way she just said it? Integration, I begin to make it my own. And then error avoidance, I begin to make it my own, but I want to say it correctly, right? I don't want to be incorrect. So this is quite a nice thing, but memory underpins most of it, right? We can't do a lot with it. If you think about input processing, we start to have prior knowledge, right? Prior knowledge starts to work on new input. We begin to notice things because we can see things that we noticed before. We don't do anything alone. Pattern identification, obviously we think about previous patterns and then how they look with this new pattern that we're looking at, and all the rest. So all of those things help us, and this is really great because now with the practicum students, I often say, okay, let's think about the rationale behind some of your tasks. Can we align it with any of this? Because this is what's happening to your students. So we can ultimately leverage working memory, and we can leverage what we know about this. And then move forward and start to think about strategies, right? Strategies that will work with working memory and that will promote them. So this is the broad sweep of what we need to think about from now on, right? Organization. If we're providing knowledge, we need to organize it. I love that. If that's all you take away, I will be really happy, right? You cannot be a messy teacher. And I don't mean messy as in you don't look very good because you all look really nice. I mean as in, okay, now I'm going to do this, then I'll do that. Now I'm going to do this. And I actually had you in my class. And remember I used to talk about feet touching. You can't walk through a lesson. Heel to toe, heel to toe, heel to toe. Any gaps you make in your lesson plan, your students will fall through them. Right? It has to be connected. Always make connections to prior knowledge. I hope I've made that quite clear. And then use images. This again talks to my two colleagues over here who've done so much with images. But basically, we are built for images. That is a go-to way of remembering, so just utilize them. But this, I think, is also critical. We need to allow for processing, and that means we need to allow time for processing. What we're often caught up in, or at least the new teachers that I see teaching, it's all about the content. It's all about, okay, where's that page? Right, what am I doing after that page? Hang on a minute. Oh, the listening. Have I got that queued up? Where's the computer? Oh, how does my PowerPoint look? It's all about content, when in actual fact, it should all be about the process. How are my students receiving the information that I'm giving them? Are they getting fatigue right now? Are they getting okay? Are they getting more than enough? Can I continue working with them or not? So as I said, these are the broad sweeps. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put you in pairs again. And I want you to just tell your partner what you've picked up from me so far. And let's hope you've picked up something. Or maybe, and it'll be maybe the thing that resonated with you. Maybe it's the thing that made you went, oh, maybe something did, right? Just tell your partner, I'm going to give you 2-3 minutes, okay? I just want to stop for a moment. I am not going to ask you what you talked about. But what I am going to say is that's always part of my lesson, right? I've been talking for how long? About 35, 40 minutes. That's too long for me, right? I've also overloaded you quite a bit, but that's because you paid for a plenary, and I feel like you should get your money's worth. If you were my students, I wouldn't quite be doing this. But having processing time, where you just say to students, let's just stop, look back. What have we done? This part of your lesson, I'm going to be really prescriptive and say should at least be 10 minutes. Because then you will hear all the errors, the problems they're having, whether what you wanted to teach them and what they learned matched, right? And you can do a lot of backtracking. But the idea of processing is really that students need to chew the language. They need to chew what you've said on their own. Teaching in real time is really hard. Learning in real time is impossible. Right? It's always delayed. So you may as well keep giving your lesson plan those periods of delay. So lesson plans, I feel, and I've done that, one of my students isn't here, but she always says, I couldn't get a really good, it doesn't quite look like this, but I'll explain it. Often when we teach, our lesson plans kind of just go forward, right? Just forward. We're like, we did this, now we're on to the next thing, now we're on to the next thing, now we're on to the next thing. Working memory tells us that doesn't work. So what we need to do is, imagine this a little bit taut. Google Images really failed me here. A little bit more like this. So that if I do that listening and I pre-teach that vocabulary, then I use that vocabulary in like 10 minutes. And then I then do another type of activity where I then do something else, which builds on this, which builds on that. It shouldn't look like this. It should look like this. Repetition of task as well, I'm going to say to you, is not boring, right? If you do a gap fill or something like that, everybody's always worried and said, oh, they did that. They got the answers. They already know the answers. Well, just take it away from them and then get them to talk about it with a different person. They've got to process, and they've got to do it in a deeper way than, let's just do this, let's move on. So we have to think about lesson plan execution and organization. So have I already mentioned this word, organize? When? Was it 2 slides ago or 3 slides ago? Are you sure? I can't remember either, but you're all good. Okay. But just so you know, I say this to my students all the time. Right? Get them to do the thinking for you. So can we organize lessons that can constantly repeat and interweave new language? I know a lot of you already do this because I've seen a lot of teachers do this recently. Mindfully thinking, right, I'm going to use that block of language, right? Then I think this next piece is really important. And again, anybody who's been taught by me knows that I think this is really important. Signposts, which engage the learners in the development of the lesson, ensure the overall learning objectives are clear. It's okay to put the agenda of what you're learning on the board. What I don't think is okay is to make it a surprise. I don't see the point. If we were going to make it a surprise, let's all be actors and go to Hollywood. We're not here trying to do a finessed product. We're trying to engage in learning, and learning is very messy, and it needs an awful lot of support. I think sometimes we throw our students out, especially when they get higher levels. We think, oh, they can do that. But actually, their working memory is at the same at the beginner level as it is at the advanced level. So you can ask your students questions like, what have we done? Right? Stop the class. Like, what have we done? What did we talk about? Then you can say, well, why did we do it? Right? Think about doing a warmer at the beginning of your class. Well, we know why we do it, right? We warm our students up. We want to wash away their outside language and begin to talk in an immersed situation. But ask them why. Why did we just talk about what you did at the weekend? Why is that important? Oh, well, Lesley, maybe because we practice English. Absolutely, we practice English. Who are you practicing English with? The person next to you. Do you like that person sat next to you? Of course I do, Lesley. Why is that important? Oh, because I feel comfortable learning. Right, now we're getting to them understanding my rationale. Right, the learning community. How did it help? What did it practice? Then, this one is my favorite question. What is a good idea to do next? Think about teaching grammar, right? Think about me maybe doing a sort of isolation piece on the past simple. And I say to my students, okay, now have you got an idea of the pattern of it? Great. What should we do next? Now, I'm hoping they say what? Practice. If they don't say practice, what's going to be the problem? They don't understand their own language learning process. So just for a minute, close your eyes and remember that slide that said stages of acquisition, right? And it began with input processing. Try to visualize yourself going through that. Then see how that overlays on teaching the past simple. You can open your eyes now because it looks a bit weird, but that's okay. But then think about if a student understands that. Now the whole point, or not the whole point of this conference, that sounds wrong, but the theme of this conference is to think about how learners can help themselves, right? If they can engage in this part of your lesson, they can think about what to do outside your class. And we already know, research has told us countless times, more learning happens outside class than it does in. We are the beginning, but we're not the end. So if you can get them to engage in, oh, right, I need to practice this. That's what Lesley told me is good. Okay. Right? And they'll autonomously begin to adopt the stages that they need to. Our lesson planning should be transparent in order to allow learners to understand our methodology and show them ways in which to help themselves. Okay? How many people have read Patten? Right? Now he said this, Learners struggle so much to get even the gist of what is being said that they have no additional resources left over to process any form, right? Even hearing something over and over again may not help. But when there is simplification of input, the comprehension burden can be eased. Input should be simplified. Right? That makes an awful lot of sense. So if we put this in terms of our instructions, the meta-language that we use, even the complication of task, you know, I want to do a running dictation, I want to do this. All of that's great, but that adds to the burden. The students are just trying to work out, what are we doing? What? Right? Or is that my son says, wait, what? Right? So they're just trying to get through that. So if we make it easier, if we simplify everything, we ultimately make it easier for themselves. Because then again, think about this working memory, long-term memory thing. That's what they're doing. That's the juggle. So just look at this again very closely. Okay. This is the same. Now, with your partner, just try and stab a guess at the words that are missing. And of course, I caught you up because I didn't say I was going to do this. I'm not going to test you. Carry on, carry on. It's amazing how powerful I feel doing this, you know that? Okay, I'm not going to ask you the results, but this is a very good task to do. You'd be surprised. Because many people think, oh, you're just putting a word in the gap, but you're not, aren't you? What are you doing? Exactly, you're trying to, and you're thinking, okay, this is what Van Patten said, so let me try and get the word that fits that, right? Always try and do this. You could imagine you can do this you might just do the text at the beginning of your lesson, but at the end, do the removed bits. And you have a lot of fun. And I do the same thing with my students that I just did with you, with going forwards and backwards. Because one thing you don't want to do is you don't ever want to not go back to this, because otherwise you get frustration. So organization starts as well, or continues, I should say, with your board plan too. Now, I know I'm going to sound old school, but I don't understand why teachers use a board as a notepad when it's really a learning tool, right? This is just a generative chart. I taught Roshi Polish a couple of weeks ago, and this was what we did, but if you can see, it's just a generative chart. This I've used for a long time, and I actually got this from another teacher who was working in New York, and she always, I don't know whether is car park British? Yeah. What do you say? Isn't it awful that I said you? That's awful. Well, I say car park, so I'm going to try, but that part of the board is anything else, right, that I want to jot down. I wouldn't do it here. Because go back to the idea of the visuospatial notepad. The students are visualizing it. If I start messing that up, now I'm not helping them. Exit cards and agendas. So this was a piece of research that we did in the fall at the New School. I know we're in Columbia, but there's also the New School, just so you know. That the teachers were asked, two teachers, Alyssa Cronland and Eileen Murphy, were asked to write agendas on the board of what they were teaching. To begin with, though, I told them not to. I said, don't write anything on the board. Just go in and teach and see what the students at the end of the lesson think you taught, which it sounds awful, but it's amazing what students actually learn and what we're trying to teach and how different they can be. So this is Eileen. She said, students will identify types of writing errors. Students will be able to correct some errors, and they'll brainstorm, blah, blah. The exit cards, the students said, love. The 5 senses. 5 senses, so that's good. The importance of 5 sense in writing, which I thought was really good, because what is, that's really poetic. Writing. So that's actually the nearest we can probably get to. Right? Talk about my teacher. So obviously you can see what Eileen did. And she was astounded. She was like, I was so obvious. How could they just walk away and think it was 5 senses? What do they think I am? And she got quite upset. So that was without the agenda. Right? Similarly, same kind of thing, but she put a little bit in of what they were going to do at the beginning of the class. So students will distinguish between different uses of modals. Students will make a short presentation recommendations. And then you can see it gets a little bit better. Modal verbs, friends modal. Some regulations, which I think is really good, which actually could be very useful. Watched friends. Eileen was really upset about that. And then advices. I was upset about that. And then watched friends. So the thing is, do your students know what to remember? Isn't that the point? Is that if we're saying, okay, you've got to try and memorize as much as possible, but if they don't even know what the lesson was about, well, are they going to go home and really think about 5 senses or friends? So how hard are they working on trying to understand our lessons rather than the content? Does that make sense?
Well, they bring a lot of friends to the class.
They did a lot. Who doesn't use friends? Like, if you don't use friends, okay then. So I've said we've already done it, pair work. And again, I think the main reason is because it's time to process. But I think it's fine to take lots of breaks in your lesson. I think it's fine. I could be wrong. I'll go home. I'll never say it again. But I think it's useful. I think about my own language learning, where I'm learning and I'm trying to pick up whatever's being said, but I need pauses. You know, you might have a 2-hour lecture. You need time to stop and go, oh, right, okay. I don't quite get that. Realizing prior knowledge, developing autonomy, noticing rehearsal, problem solving, co-construction, analysis, all of that. You know, often you say pair work, why? And teachers will say, oh, to practice English. That's actually possibly the least reason I might do it sometimes. They've got a complicated grammar structure. They need that time. And notice, again, it's leveraging all of the stages I said before, right? The noticing prior knowledge, processing. So it's allowing for those things that we know already have to happen. How many people have looked at this, spaced repetition, right? So if we remember Ebbinghaus's decay of memory, what this does is basically it says, all right, okay, so if I look at when students decay, so if I look at when memory starts to break down, I'll put in some more practice work. I'll do more practice work. I'll do more practice work. Now, luckily, we don't have to do it because there are many apps now. Have you seen them? Anki being one, where they'll put together this for the students. The students just have the Anki app. They put in the flashcards, and it will tell them on specific days what they're supposed to remember, and it mixes it up for them. Because this is actually quite hard for us to do. We just know we need to repeat. I don't necessarily think, oh, yeah, I better do it now because I think they're losing. I wouldn't engage in that. But that's becoming much more important. And one thing I want to tell you about is a piece of research that happened in the UK and in the US. And they did this with kids. They were like 13, 14, 15-year-old children. And they had to take a test. So what they did was they did 20 minutes of instruction, paused it. The kids went off and played. They played basketball. They played different. I doubt they did that in the UK, but they probably played cricket. But they went off and played, and then they came back for, no, that would be the teacher. Then they came back, and they had another 20 minutes of the same instruction, and then they did it again. And the test results were through the roof. They did so well because they had that right at the point where they might have been losing something, they got it again. And they had enough distraction because the thing was it had to be play. It was nothing to do with language. Okay? So again, we're becoming much more aware of memory is a little bit more scientific than we thought. And I know as teachers we don't like to be too scientific because we didn't study science, and so we don't think we know it. But all they did that we didn't do was read it. So give it to me and I'll read it and maybe we can work together. I think it's happening anyway. Some people have already said it, and Peter Doolittle told us. There are other things we can use, but definitely images, right? This was something I got students to do. This is one of the outreach classes that Mary was talking about. I got them to visualize anger, and I said it cannot be a picture of a thing. Has to be just a kind of symbol or whatever. And that, I think, is fantastic, because who doesn't know that that's anger, right? Repetition is not a dirty word. It really isn't. It may be not a nice word, but it's not a dirty word. It's the foundation, right? I'm not telling you to do this for like 15 hours a day. I'm just saying let's not do it, right? Other ways of making... Whoa, whoa. That's crashing. No, that's Chomsky. He's coming to... So, other ways to make language memorable, some people have already said it. It's over there. Motivation, you do something that they enjoy, right? It makes sense. Association, always associative. New vocabulary, associate it with something that you know that they know. Personalization, makes sense. Anything they have to work with, right? Decision making, thinking about, is this a positive word? Is this a negative word? Is this a formal word? Is this an informal word? Could I use this with my boss? Could I use this with my friend? All questions you don't need to give them the answers, they can work out. Affective factors, this is what the gentleman in the middle said. We actually know that the more upset we are, sometimes the better we learn. But really, if we're involved or engaged in something, it could be that we're having a lot of fun with something. It could be that we're angry about it. We don't quite agree with it. Think about some of the pros and cons type discussions you have. That's all good. That's all good. And then contextualization with repetition. Contextualization, I'm talking to the converted because you already know this. So what I want to do now are two things. I need some volunteers, and I just want to do one activity that really works that you can maybe try on Monday if you want. So can I have Judy, could you come and stand here and just hold this card up? And then Jackie, notice I'm just asking friends. And then working memory. And then Caitlin, could you do aptitude? Do you want to do overload? And then I need 3 more. Roshi's filming. Do you want to? Yep, please. Oh, we need visuals. Oh, there you go. Thank you. I love people who volunteer. Okay, just everybody. Are we all in line? You're just going to repeat it with me. Okay, that's all you're going to do. So first one, capacity. Visuals. Aptitude. Organization. Working memory. Overload. Less is more. Could we just say it a bit pacier, please? Right then, first one. Okay, then Judy's was? Capacity. Next one. Visual. Excellent. Next one. Aptitude. Next one. Next one. Next one. Overload. Next one? Okay, then, and now I'm just going to... But you're still going to say it, okay? Next one. Start at the beginning.
Capacity, visuals, aptitude,
Woo!
organization, working memory, overload, less is more.
Okay, do it again.
Capacity, visuals, aptitude, organization, working memory, overload, less is more.
Could you switch yours around? Could you switch yours around? Okay, again, please.
Capacity, visuals, aptitude, organization, working memory, overload, less is more.
Okay, let's go. I'm hurrying you. I don't do this with students. Right, go on then.
Capacity, visuals, aptitude, organization, working memory, overload, less is more.
Right then, final one. Let's just do the whole thing. Come on, we got it.
Capacity, visuals, aptitude, organization, working memory, overload, less is more.
Give yourself a clap. Okay, you can sit down. Thank you. Why did I use these words? Keywords, thank you. Keywords and association, definitely. It's all connected. This is, well, that's an interesting thing. When you look at somebody, it does make a difference. But this idea of moving it, you could just erase it from the whiteboard. If you finished a class and you've got a bunch of vocabulary on the board, just put circles around them and then start erasing it. You don't need to use cards. Okay, so for the very final thing, because I've come to the end, I I just want you to look under your chair, and there should be a Post-it. It's either on the floor or actually on your chair. Some people at the back might not have them, but I could. Okay? Got it? Everybody get it? Okay, what I want you to do is think of one thing. One thing. This is much harder. One thing that resonated with you, and write it on that piece of card. If you want to write more, that's fine. If you want to write more, I'm not going to have these. You're not going to hand them in to me. But something that resonated. Okay? All I'm going to ask you to do, if you are my students, this is what I tell you to do, is stick that somewhere where you get home, not in the toilet, somewhere nice. And then when you look at it again, think about this morning. Okay? If you were students, you can see how useful that might be. But just stick it somewhere, and then every time you kind of look at it, you're not just going to remember that one word. You're going to remember a lot more. But you will remember it, and you will do it in a spaced way. Okay? So thank you very much, everybody. I think I've come to the end. This is now question times, but I'm only going to say be kind. But that's my email if you want to. If you are interested in any kind of research about memory, please contact me. It's a really, I'm looking for volunteers. I'm always looking for help because it really isn't something that people like talking about, as I've told you. Okay?
Any questions?
I don't need the mic. Okay.
Okay.
I just wanted to comment more of a question. I really liked how, like with your presentation, usually when speakers do presentations, they talk and talk and talk and talk. So there's always like a joke that you make, and there's image the moment like our attention goes down, and I think it's very helpful for students as well.
I think it's
just in terms of timing.
Yeah, and it's a thing that I can't sit through it. But if you think of processing time, how long is TED Talks?
16 minutes.
Why? They've done research on it. They've done research to see, and it's 20 minutes, it's gone. Yeah, thank you.
I have a question. I guess the one thing I'm slightly skeptical about, and I'm going to let you convince me that you were right all along, was the tray full of glasses point. That is when students reach overload and all the glasses fall off. Yeah. And I would have put it as they reach a point of overload and then they don't learn anything after that. But everything you did up to that point is probably still okay? Or is it the case that that processing into long-term memory at all gets lost? So can you talk a little more about that?
No, that's a really good question. So this really came from, there's really two schools of thought. And Badley is the person that really came up with this. And his idea was actually there was a kind of exchange that happens. And you might want to agree with that instead. That, you give somebody something else and they go, oh, God, that's more important. So forget that. I'm going to remember that. So that possibly does happen. What isn't added is the fact that we're doing it in a second, third, fourth language. And that's what changes. And when I go back to the Cantonese lesson, quite honestly, it was my own experience. I got so frustrated, the affective side of my learning overpowered everything else. So it's not essentially a scientific thing, but it's definitely based on feeling. That you just feel like, and then you get, if you're with kids and you overload kids, they just get angry. If you overload adults, they start to feel bad about themselves. But for sure, Badley says more likely in exchange. But he didn't talk about language.
Hi, I have two questions actually, if you don't mind. So one, if memory is as important as we say, and I agree with you, I believe it is, should we be thinking about ways of helping our students improve their memory?
Yeah.
That's part one. Part two is most people have classes with multiple students, 15 to 20, and obviously it's sort of a normal curve. I've always got a couple of low ones. Most of them are average, and I've got some very intelligent ones. So how do you sort of reconcile the pacing when you have that normal curve of students in your class?
Yeah. So it says a lot, because I've already forgotten your first question. No, just no. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We do have to have strategies. I mean, we've already heard, the sort of the first word. I can remember Mars Dikra, because it's mouth, esophagus, stomach, ileum, duodenum. That's how I remembered that, and that was from when I was 13. we can think about lots of different ways and strategies. I think it's absolutely right. And that's why it's difficult today in a way, because I've talked a lot about working memory, right? And you're more talking about converting things to long-term memory. So there's two different types of things. But yeah, I mean, we're not going to not try and help our students, right? We're going to give them everything. But I do think we've stepped back from it. And then I think, this idea of pacing with students who find it easier, students who find it much more difficult, I think that pair work will always help you with that. And the advanced students, or the students who've, and I don't tend to use intelligence so much, but the students who've seen the language maybe more, who have all of that aptitude that we mentioned before, and it's more heightened, the more that you work with them in terms of processing, the more that they will put in for themselves. So it doesn't make the lesson a waste of time. They just begin to talk about something else, something maybe deeper. But we've got to teach the quorum, right? Sorry, she's got the...
I have the microphone. I work in a homogeneous school where in the culture, memorization and repetition is high priority.
Yeah.
High priority, and a lot of it, especially of the memorization. And I find that with my students, especially the older ones, I teach in a school of grades 1 through 9. The older ones, they are so keen on getting the memorization and the repetition because of exams. But so I find that there's not that much application.
Yeah.
And the idea of discussing, what did we learn? Why did we learn it? Like, I loved that thing that you said, but then I'm saying, and I wrote it all down, but I'm like, I don't think they want to talk about why. Yeah. Or how, and what we should do next, and what do you?
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right, and this is part of learner training, isn't it? That we need to, as well as we teach our students, we train our students how to learn. And you've said a great point that students do love rote memorization, I think. Interestingly enough, when I did the interview with the students, the 30, only one of them said that they actually memorized anything. But I lived in Asia for years. I absolutely know about rote memorization. So we have got to say, okay, well, we've done that, now what do we need to do with it? I think you just, little at a time. I don't think you should revolutionize your lesson plan, but I think you should try. And then, what are these questions useful? How much can you learn in the lesson when you're with me? You're with me for what, 45 minutes to maybe 3 hours. You're at home an awful lot. Do you want to get into university? Let's try and work together. So you can share some real tactics of, we're trying to work together. It's not the case, and this is definitely what I had to fight against in Asia. I'm the best one in the class. I'm put on the pedestal. And I had to work with that. We're working together, right? So try it. Yes, you might get some pushback, but keep going, okay?
How do you decide which word you teach to your students? Do you teach them high frequency words, low frequency words? Do you teach word families?
Yeah.
Do you teach them in context?
Yeah.
Through interleaved learning? I'm just curious.
It all depends on who my students are in front of me. Right now, I pay more attention to the outreach students because that's who I've been teaching. But through my career, I've taught ESP, I've taught all sorts of different things. It just depends who you've got in front of you. High frequency words are not the be-all and end-all for our university students, for example. So it depends on their needs. But I definitely want to say contextualization, yes. If I can avoid decontextualized language, I want. You can't always. When you think of text, there's often decontextual language that we have to teach. And it kind of looks a bit different, but I try to make it as much as possible. Word families I worry about sometimes because, again, the research is out on that. Do we learn things because they're all in chunks together? I don't think we really know. What tends to make us learn is relevance, right? If I think I need that, I'm going to process it more. So I guess the needs analysis is where you'd work on whatever you need to do.
So I have a 4-hour class and a 6-hour class.
Yeah.
So how do you engage those students?
Yeah.
And what would be the correct time to give them breaks from your experience?
Well, quite honestly, I mean, many people are going to go nuts, but I'd say every hour. there has to be a break. I don't mean that you send them out of the classroom. I mean, maybe you do something just a little bit different. Maybe you get them to stand up, walk around. I asked the teachers actually at the new school, what do you do when the motivation goes down? And there was yoga and there lots of really creative different ideas. Because the reality is, we just can't. We just can't. And I've done that. I had, you try one-on-one, a French lawyer, I'll never forget it, for 8 hours every day. And boy, did we do something together. I don't quite know what. But you really, really need to. You maybe just need to be a bit creative about how you're doing it. I also don't think that it's wrong to get students just to move and change partners. All of that's good.
Okay. Are there any software programs you could recommend that would, measure things?
Where is this voice coming from?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I was like, I can't. Okay. Not that I necessarily need to know, but it's one of those weird things of like, ooh.
I'm the kid who always
Can
sits.
they all hear this voice? Right, go on.
I'm the kid who always sits in the background.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Any particular software that would automatically tally up things like lexical diversity, plus those higher level words where we could just enter we could copy paste the writing into a system and it'll tally up like the number of differently used words and high level words. Any off
I don't.
Top of your head,
Anybody
or anybody?
I mean, that's used. I mean, there's lots of content driven ones.
Word and phrase.
Word and phrase. Thank you. Word and phrase.info. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What kind of other things did people mention in the answers besides vocabulary? Like what grammar structures, what kind of pronunciation issues?
Yeah, nobody, and that was a good question, Jackie, because I was sure people were going to say pronunciation. Nobody did. And like I said, I had 50 and 30. This is the start. It's got to go much, much wider than that. But I was surprised that people didn't say that. Grammar, difficult to understand, fine once you got to the understanding point. So they didn't really mention that. The idea, and it doesn't help, that what did you just see Oxford say how many words there are? It was like 250,000. Did you see that ad? And the students came in and said, look at this. I mean, we've just got crazy amount of words. So I think that's it. But yeah, not really anything else.
So, in terms of chunking, what size is a chunk? Like, is there any research on the maximum size of a chunk?
It's a piece of string right now. It really isn't. It's just lots of people are coming up with lots of different ideas. I don't even think everybody's quite different. But certainly the idea of 4 chunks is it. But I've seen a chunk was 1 word in one of the pieces of research that I saw. Another, it was 10 words. But I think then we get into the unrealistic then. I don't think we've done enough on it.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions. Anyone? Okay. So then I'm going to say thank you so much, Lesley, for this wonderful plenary.